Let's talk a little bit about the origins of the Ottoman Empire. It started off as a relatively small Turkic tribe that broke off from the Seljuks in 1299, which is generally seen as the beginning of the Ottoman Empire. Located on the eastern periphery of Anatolia, it quite soon became engaged in conflict with the Byzantium Empire that was located in Constantinople. Eastern Rome is the other name that you might have heard before. And it fought its first battle with Byzantium in 1302 successfully, and then remained engaged in constant conflict with Byzantium for the next 150 years, until 1453, where it destroyed the Byzantium Empire, occupied the city of Constantinople, and turned it into its capital city, renaming it Istanbul. Here you have a painting of the siege of Constantinople. Subsequently, it expanded into, as you can see on the map, it expanded into Eastern and Central Europe, occupying large parts of the Balkans, including Hungary, which became Ottoman tributary states. And then simultaneously also it expanded further northeast into the Black Sea and the Crimea. The siege of Vienna was attempted twice, in 1529 and 1683. Both times the siege itself failed, as you can see on these paintings. But it was a very dramatic moment for Western Europe, and it's easily, you can easily imagine how the course of history would have looked different if that siege had succeeded. And it's only the second time that the Islamic empires encroached on Western Europe proper. The first time, if you might remember from last week, was when the Umayyads came from Spain into southern France. The Ottomans simultaneously moved eastwards, engaged in conflict with the Safavid Empire in present-day Iran, and southwestwards towards the Abbasid Caliphate that operated out of Cairo. And it defeated the Abbasid Caliphate in 1517. And this particular defeat is momentous because it, as you remember, the Abbasids were the holders of the Caliphate. And so the Ottoman sultans in Istanbul are now assuming in 1519, 2 years after the defeat of the Abbasids, they transfer the caliphate to themselves. We'll return to the issue of the caliphate later this week when we talk about the Turkish Republic's decision to abolish that institution. Let's now talk a little bit about the ethnic diversity of this empire, which is linked to the way it was created. Like previous Muslim empires, the Ottomans were primarily interested in enlarging the area governed by Muslims. But as such, they had no interest necessarily in converting the subjugated populations to Islam, as perhaps other religions might have done. And this is not necessarily due to a particular notion of tolerance, as some Muslim apologetics in the 20th century might have presented it, but primarily due to the limited physical abilities of these conquerors and the particular incentive structure that developed out of the way Islamic law had developed, particularly with respect to taxes. So the Ottoman Empire was highly heterogeneous and contained a multitude of ethnic, linguistic, religious communities that lived not so much with each other, but side by side. It has been described as a mosaic, which I think is a good image to describe the particular way the society was structured. While the Sunni Muslims were clearly privileged group in that empire, it would be inaccurate to paint a picture of general suppression of minorities. It is important to remember that all of the minorities, particularly the Jewish and Christian minorities, were heavily involved in the administration, which again goes back to the way the Muslim conquerors, the Ottomans, but also other their predecessors, were governing the areas that had come under their control. They generally left the administration in place, because for practical reasons, because they did not have the administrators themselves. They had no experience with administration. These are horse people from the steppe, warriors more than administrators. So they generally, it was a logical decision to leave the administration in place. But also because the way taxation was governed in the religious law, it was more advantageous for them to tax non-Muslim populations. So to cut a highly complex story short, while forced conversions certainly did take place, and while Muslims enjoyed a privileged position, the Muslim expansion, both in pre-Ottoman periods and under the Ottomans, did not lead to homogeneous Muslim societies, and this is for primarily two reasons. First, the Muslim conquests were undertaken by relatively small, if committed, troops which lacked administrative experience and capability. So the conquerors generally left the existing administrative practices in place and allowed the subjugated populations to continue with their way of life, in particular with their established religious and social practices. Secondly, prophetic practice had established a very strong legal precedent of how to deal with, and a highly convenient precedent of how to deal with subjugated non-Muslim populations. If you remember, both the Quran and the Prophet, they recognized the so-called people of the book, those who share the monotheistic belief in one God, at that time the Christians and the Jews. So the religion recognizes them as people who have a faith that's almost as good as Muslims. They're not clearly inferior to Muslims, but they are recognized as decent enough. So the law and prophetic practice and the Quran recognize the dhimmi status for the people of the book. And that status is a simple, relatively simple bargain. It's a contract of protection by the Muslim ruler in exchange for payment of a special tax. And this protective contract could be extended to people living permanently under Muslim rulers. There would be dhimmis, or also people who come for a temporary period into Muslim lands, and then they would get an aman, a protective letter. So this precedent of the special tax in return for protection paid by the people of the book was then extended to the Zoroastrian people of Iran when Iran came under Muslim governance, and to the Hindu people of India. And this process of extension and of a status to people who were originally not covered by it, it's a sign of the flexibility that is shown by the Islamic law and Islamic governance in practice. However, it has never been recognized dogmatically. And Muslim apologetics in recent times have pointed out to this practice of the Muslim state allowing non-Muslims to live freely within it under its protection and prospering as a sign of the tolerance of the religion. It is questionable whether tolerance really is or was the motivating factor here, rather than opportunism and convenience of governance. And particularly in the Ottoman sense, lack of interest in creating strong integrated statehood. But the practical effects were certainly much more advantageous legal and social position for the minorities than they experienced in other types of governance in other parts of the world. One of the elements explaining the rapid expansion of Islam under the Umayyads and the Abbasids, and still observable in Ottoman times, is the willing acceptance of non-Muslim populations of their new Muslim overlords, particularly in the Byzantine and the Sassanid territories that came under Muslim suzerainty. Here often Muslim authority was not necessarily imposed, but actually came about by contract between the subjugated populations and the new Muslim ruler, based on the legal institution of the dhimmi, who is protected in return for paying a jizya tax. And the willingness to accept this position is linked to this tax often being actually lower than what these populations had been paying to their Byzantine or Sassanid previous rulers, and by the autonomy that they generally enjoyed under Muslim rule to govern their own affairs. Another striking and recurring feature of Muslim governance is the dislocation of rulers from the ruled. It's quite rare that the rulers spring up from the same area in which they actually come to govern. So we have often an ethnic and linguistic difference between the two. And they often originate from geographically fairly distant areas. So the combined effect of this legal and religious heritage, the military limitations of small conquering armies, and certainly not least the habitual predisposition of particularly the Ottomans throughout history, where explain the rather distant form of governance that we see in the Ottoman Empire. It's a form of governance by proxy. And part of this reliance on proxy rulers is the inability of the Ottomans to reliably assess and collect resources from the lands that came under their control. Initially, after the conquest, all land belonged to the state, the ruler, but the ruler generally did not administer these lands himself or through his administrators, but they gave them, as the institution was called in Ottoman times, as iqta lands, to the individual soldiers in return for military services. And while we cannot explore fully here the complexity of that system, one thing is important to note, that this arrangement that looks feudal and is feudal in certain aspects did not develop the highly stable mutual rights and obligations between patron and client that we see in the European and some other feudal systems in the world, but it remains relatively unstable in legal terms. Secondly, the tax take accruing to the state, both in absolute terms and in relative terms, remains very small, because let's call them the middleman, the actual person administrating or to whom the land was given, the soldier, kept most of the benefits of these lands. And as the system disintegrated, also the military services were no longer as reliably given to the ruler. So, which then eventually lead to the system of iltizam, the tax farming, where the right to tax is auctioned off to private individuals, which causes its own problems. So, as we will see shortly, this inability to collect taxes is one of the reasons the modernization period in the 19th century brings about financial collapse in both Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, because the costly modernization processes cannot be paid for reliably from the tax base that in objective terms should have been there. So another feature of Islamic governance in general, and Ottoman governance in particular, is the noted lack of interest in creating, in regulating the legal affairs of its subjects in a comprehensive manner. Perhaps this is due to legal and religious stipulations, but that is now it's one of the issues that can be debated. But at this point, we can simply observe that legal matters were left almost exclusively to the religious communities, which in the Ottoman Empire, that was a highly heterogeneous, multi-ethnic, multi-religious empire, led to the system of millets, as they came to be known in the Ottoman Empire, where each religious community was operating its own courts and regulating its own administrative affairs themselves. Here we have a picture of a Qadi court regulating the Muslim communities. And these courts were, the Muslim courts, the Qadi courts, were sanctioned by the government, but they were essentially private religious scholars administrating a law of fiqh that was developed by private individuals, not by the state. And this we will come back to repeatedly throughout this course. It's one of the noted shortcomings, both of the institution of the caliphate and of the Islamic governance as such, that the ability to authoritatively state what the law is never accrued to the state, but was left with private individuals. For the non-Muslim populations, this meant that they could govern their own affairs in their own courts and system, in their own communities, which is on the one hand highly advantageous, on the other hand contributed to this fact that we do not have populations that actually grow together but remain very separate. And it's, as you see on this picture here, the different flags represented different millets in the Ottoman Empire. And as soon as the government then tried to come up with state law that affects and regulated their own affairs, these entrenched rights and interests of the millets obviously were affected, and that showed that created resistance. And in the particular Ottoman case, it's important to note, and we come back to this later, that the millets that were religiously different from the Muslim rulers had attracted the interests of outside powers, mainly Christian European powers, who then took it upon themselves to protect certain of these religious communities, both for perhaps generally felt reasons of kinship, but also, and perhaps primarily, as a rather convenient excuse to interfere in the internal affairs of the Ottoman Empire for self-interested reasons. And we will return to the question of the legal equality of the Ottoman citizens and how it affected the millet system in the next video dedicated to the Ottoman reform movement in the 19th century.